The Young and the Restless spoilers Saturday's full episode September 6, 2025. In Genoa City, as summer tilted into the softer light of early autumn, the Newman and Abbott orbit felt like a city of glass beautiful, brittle, and one wrong vibration away from a spectacular shatter. On the top floor of the ranch, Nikki decided that her husband did not need another lecture, another strategic briefing, or another round of counter intel masquerading as pillow talk. He needed to be reminded of the one currency he never had to buy: devotion. She set the stage with a curator's eye, letting memory be the designer, the old silver ice bucket polish until it caught the chandelier like moonlight. The single white rose clipped short and slipped into a crystal bud vase, a turntable pulling up a song from a dance they had stolen decades ago when they were younger and just as dangerous. There were no board documents laid out on the desk tonight, no dossiers, no maps with pins and red string, just a tray with his favorite finger foods, a decanter breathing, and a throw draped over the sofa where they had weathered 100 storms together. When Victor walked in coat over his forearm, thoughts still marching in formation was met by the unexpected luxury of being somebody's piece. Nikki took his phone and slipped it face down on the marble, her smile a private embargo on the world, and coaxed him into the kind of evening that doesn't announce itself as strategy, but accomplishes more than a dozen meetings. She listened more than she spoke, asked him about a horse they hadn't seen in months, about a painting they'd briefly considered acquiring, about a quiet wish he once confessed on a night when he believed wishes were for other men. She reminded him of the reasons to choose restraint without attempting to handcuff his instincts. The trick with Victor had never been to stop him, but to tune him. As the music slowed and the decanter went light, she locked eyes with him and managed, with tenderness honed over a lifetime of fire drills, to cool the temperature of his war room heart. The indulgence, if one could call it, that wasn't an escape from the battlefield, but a rearming of the soul. With Victor, love was never just a feeling, it was a tactical advantage that softened edges, widened perspective, and, crucially, made him resist the temptation to scorch earth when a surgical strike-ear silence would do. Across town, in a venue that was equal parts theater and confession booth, Kane Ashby curated a very different kind of atmosphere. He had converted a private space into the fantasy of a railcar, a sleek, chrome-trimmed capsule with riveted details, mahogany banquettes, sconce lighting that hummed like a memory, and a bar polished to a conductor's whistle. Anyone could rent a conference room. Only a strategist with something to prove would stage a negotiation inside a meticulously recreated choo-choo train, the irony embraced and underlined. The message was layered. It could move with momentum. He could turn a nostalgia piece into an engine of deals. He understood that environment isn't decor, it's leverage. When Michael Baldwin stepped in, keen eyes first, skepticism second, charm third, it didn't even sit before he read the room aloud, the way a lion reads a savanna for traps. The train motif, he observed with a clipped smile, was not subtle. It announced intention, velocity, inevitability. Kane let the observation land and did not waste it with false modesty. He handed Michael a drink not as a bribe, but as a prop, something for the attorney's hands while his mind sharpened to a point. The first volley wasn't about money or titles, it was about motive. Why had Kane invited Lauren and Michael to Nice? Why the dinners on a terrace with the water slipping blue around the edges of conversation? Why the careful choreography that included distance from Genoa City, plausible deniability, and enough beauty to lower guard without clouding judgment? Michael wanted the answer stated out loud, not implied by sunsets and tasting menus. Kane obliged with a clarity that startled because it was true. There are not many people with Michael's skill set, fewer still who can calibrate a mess without leaving fingerprints, and almost none who can operate inside the moral fog that covers corporate warfare without losing themselves entirely. Kane had watched him for years in courtrooms, boardrooms, and those liminal spaces where influence is traded in whisper. Sam concluded that retirement was a word better suited to golf than to a mind like Baldwin's. But Michael had not walked into that railcar to be seduced by flattery, and he hadn't left Newman's long shadow simply to stand in someone else's. He listened with the patience of a man who had seen every version of this pitch and still respected the artistry of each attempt. When Kane spoke of opportunity, Michael countered with cost. He pivoted the conversation to sacrifices tallied and unrequited late nights that purchased someone else's empire, compromises that tore at his wife's trust, victories so sharp they cut both ways. He said he was retired because the ledger finally balanced only when he stopped adding new debts with old zeros. Victor, he argued without venom, but without apology, rarely paid in anything but power. The people around him paid in sleep, in marriages, in the quiet erosion of their faces in the mirror. Look at what you had to give up, Michael pressed, leveling the beam on Kane rather than the past. Now look at what Victor had to give up. The implication hung between them like a crossing arm lowering over a track effective. Unignorable. A warning that the next move could crumple metal. Kane didn't flinch. A lesser operator would have defended Victor or denounced him. Kane did neither. He conceded that Victor had always been a good boss in the way a storm can be a good relief you angle your roof right. He acknowledged the asymmetry of the exchange, but suggested, gently and without begging, that he was not inviting Michael to return to servitude. He was offering a different kind of engagement, not a courtroom crusade or a corporate officer's oath, but a technician's mandate to adjust a complex machine so it stops chewing up everyone who feeds it. A fixer, yes, in the old cynical sense, but also a steward in the new ethical sense, someone who could impose order where ambition had become a hazard. The mention of nice unspooled into its true purpose under the steady heat of Michael's interrogation. Those dinners had not been auditions so much as stress test school. They talk about ugly realities without soiling the tablecloth. Could Lauren's antennae for character pick up a frequency Kane had failed to detect in himself? Could a gesture of generosity be made without being mistaken for a bribe? Kane understood that men like Michael are not one with checks. They are one with context, with the long view, with respect enough to let them walk if the ask is wrong. So Kane let him rise to go, refused to close the distance with desperation, and applied the smallest pressure a negotiator can use: permission. If the timing is wrong, let it be wrong. The number will still be correct tomorrow. Keep my personal, he said, and simply Esqueto stored. It was a request with teeth hidden behind its manners, because once the number lives in your phone, it also lives in your mind. A quiet icon waiting for the moment when your certainty thins. Michael agreed not to the job, not to the mission, but to the possibility, and in that agreement lay the germ of everything that comes after. He walked out with the train's low hum at his back, aware that even a pretend locomotive has a pull if you stand too close for too long. Meanwhile, the indulgent evening at the ranch did not pass without consequence. Pampering Victor was never just about candles and vintages. It was a way to place hands on the thermostat of a man who could boil oceans. Nikki guided him through the garden of their shared history, each memory an argument for temperance dressed as nostalgia. She spoke of wins he'd savored, mossed ones that didn't require a public hanging, the ones resolved with the elegance of restraint, and of legacies that calcify not through domination, but through endurance. The very act of prioritizing him as a husband over him as a general nudged something inside his calculus. Nikki had chosen her moment well, because she knew the currents in town were shifting, and when currents shift you can either fight them or ride them into a better lane. She wanted him flexible, not passive, discerning, not paranoid. She kept Lauren's name off her lips, but not out of her thoughts. In another corner of the city, the woman was probably counting minutes on a mental abacus, weighing her husband's hunger for relevance against her hunger for a marriage more ordinary than their myth ever allowed. Nikki understood that men like Victor and Michael didn't retire from the game so much as rotate through different vantage points. If Kane's invitation resonated with Michael at the level of ego or duty, Lauren would feel the tremor. Nikki wanted, for both of them, a season of less violence, physical or otherwise. By the time Michael reached his car, the evening had soaked through him like rain that hadn't fallen. His answer in the rail car had been crisp, almost rehearsed. He was retired, he did not miss the adrenaline, and he would not lease out his conscience to paint over someone else's mess. But speeches feel different once the door clicks shut. In the quiet, he let the argument breathe in the other direction. Retired from what exact littles or purpose? Had he really left the field because he was satisfied, or because he feared the next case would hollow him out for good? Kane's cell had not been built on the cult of personality or the promise of impunity. It had been built on a frank diagnosis. Some machines were running to hot, and if nobody with real skills recalibrated them, everyone within reach would burn. There was a version of his acceptance, he admitted to himself, that wouldn't be a relapse, but a reform if he set conditions, drew boundaries, and made the job about preventing harm rather than enabling it. He thought of Lauren and the promise he'd made with more than a ring, that the second half of their life together would not be spent flinching whenever his phone buzzed after midnight. He could honor that promise and still do work that mattered, couldn't he? Or was that the oldest lie men in his line told themselves right before gravity proved stronger than intent? Kane, for his part, did not celebrate the partial win. He dismantled the evening like a watchmaker what had ticked, what had snagged, what could be polished. The choo-choo conceded detail he leaned into with enough self-awareness to disarm mockery had done its job. It put people at ease while telling them, subliminally, that he could move a car made of steel with nothing but rhythm and momentum. He had resisted the urge to trash Victor in front of a man who had once built his career arguing the very cases that maintain Victor's weather system. He had framed the work not as a dagger, but as a suture. If Michael was the surgeon he believed him to be, that metaphor would itch. He would feel the tug each time he read a headline or overheard a whisper about corporate maneuvering turning reckless. He would remember that someone had asked him to fix something before it broke beyond repair. Kane also understood the secondary audience of his pitch. Lauren, you don't recruit a man like Michael without recruiting his wife's peace of mind. The dinner and nice hadn't been excess. It had been context, a chance for Lauren to see whether Kane's ambitions smelled like smoke or like clean air after rain. He hadn't asked her to trust him. He had asked her to watch him and see if trust was possible. Back at the ranch, as the night folded in, Nikki rested her head on Victor's shoulder and felt the subtle drop in his pulse that meant thought, not rage, had taken the wheel. She loved him best when he remembered the pleasure of patience. She spoke, almost lazily, about a gala they might attend, a donation they might make, a young executive who needed mentoring, a way to turn a power play into a scholarship that would make a better headline and, quietly, a better world. She wasn't naive. She had survived the carousel of his empire too long for that. But she believed that indulgence, when wielded with art, becomes a kind of covenant. I will give you sanctuary tonight so that, tomorrow, you will choose the smaller hammer. Somewhere in the city, phone numbers were being saved. In this room, a vow was being renewed. Both were seeds, which would bloom first depended, as it always did in Genoa City, on the weather, the soil, and who felt the sun most urgently. In the days that followed, the aftershocks rippled through channels that do not show up on paper. A junior associate at a boutique firm mentioned, over coffee, that a well-appointed gentleman had asked curious hypotheticals about cross-border enforcement without naming clients. A maitre d' at an unlisted supper club remarked that a familiar face was dining without his usual entourage, lingering over dessert like a man trying to stretch the safe minutes of a dangerous day. On the Newman side, Nikki found Victor marginally less inclined to call a midnight meeting to weaponize a rumor. He listened to a report in full before he ordered someone to lean. And twice he ordered no leaning at all. These were small adjustments from outside the circle, but inside the circle, they felt like the slide of a dial that could, if kept steady, save lives and fortunes. Michael did not call Kane. He did, however, open his contacts twice, and each time his thumb hovered over a new entry with a name that meant leverage wrapped in charm. He tucked the phone away and took Lauren's hand on a walk with the dog, the ordinary choreography of a life they had fought to preserve. He told her, not about the details, but about the shape of the offer framed as service rather than sin, as prevention rather than provocation, and asked her what she wanted him to want. Lauren, who had never been impressed by a man's ability to conquer a room if he couldn't make a bed, gave him the answer that made it possible to breathe. She wanted him whole. If he could do this and remain whole, she could live with the movement around them. If the work asked for pieces he couldn't grow back, the answer was no. It wasn't a veto, it was a vow to the version of him that had made their home a sanctuary, not a bunker. Kane, hearing nothing, kept the engine warm without burning fuel. He sent no gifts, deployed no emissaries, and let the space between them build a kind of charge. He made other calls, not as consolation prizes, but as parallel place compliance specialists, auditors with reputations for inconvenient honesty, technologists who could make data behave without making it lie. If Michael came aboard, Kane wanted him to find a scaffolding already erected, a team that suggested structure rather than improvisation, seriousness rather than swagger. He crafted a short document, 3 pages, no legalese, no flatter-yodeling the proposition as if it were a public interest project, stabilize volatile interfaces between legacy power and emerging risk, reduce collateral damage, protect non-combatants, and, when force is necessary, ensure it is proportionate, lawful, and humane. He left a blank line at the top where a name might go, or might not. He put the document in a drawer and waited, not like a gambler facing down a river card, but like a winemaker who knows that sometimes the art is in the pause. Nikki watched her husband sleep that week with the quiet satisfaction of a strategist whose plan had not failed. He still bristled, still prowled, still launched the occasional spear into the marketplace to remind competitors he was present. But the wildfires were fewer, the scorch marks softer at the edges. She understood that love had not removed the iron from his blood, it had only taught it to bend. She also understood that the city's next crisis would not ask for permission before it arrived. When it did, she hoped the man beside her would meet it with the version of himself she had coaxed to the surface, the one who counted the cost before he counted the trophies, the one who valued a long game that did not grind his people to powder. In another neighborhood, a rail car bar waited inside a building that had never seen a track. Its lights were off, but the scent of citrus oil from the polished wood hung in the air, the olfactory memory of a meeting that had not ended so much as shifted into a slower gear. Michael's phone slept on a nightstand, the new number nestled among old loyalties and newer boundaries. Genoa City is a place where phones ring at inconvenient hours and lives tilt on sentences that begin with one more thing. But for now the house was quiet. There is a fiction that decisions are made in the roar of a moment. More often, they are made in the hush that follows, when someone chooses which version of themselves to be tomorrow. And somewhere between a rose in a crystal vase and a bar polished like a signal mirror, 2 men and a woman who loves one of them had made exactly that kind of choice, planting the kind of seeds that the city of glass knows how to grow into either a sheltering grove or a forest of mirrors. Only time measured not in episodes, but in the caliber of their next moves would tell which harvest they would claim. When the call finally comes, it may not be a call at all. It may be a text with a time and a place, deliberately mundane, framed as coffee, not combat. It may be an email with 3 bullet points and no signature. It may be silence broken, not by an ask, but by an offer. Here are the conditions under which I work. Here are the conditions under which I walk. Here is the line I will not cross, even if it means your plan must change. And if that message exists, Nikki's quiet campaign will have contributed, Kane's patient theater will have helped, and Michael's hard-won wisdom will have prevailed. Until then, Genoa City does what it always does: watches, speculates, bets. It sees Nikki indulging her husband and mistakes it for softness. It sees Kane staging his meetings on a make-believe train and mistakes it for vanity. It sees Michael claim retirement and mistakes it for an ending. The truth, as always here, is less glamorous but more dangerous. The game continues, not louder, but smarter. And the players who can bear both love and pressure are the ones who will keep their empires from turning on them. For now, the number is saved. For now, the rose still drinks water. For now, the rail car's lights are off. But the track's real, or imaginaire already laid. And the city of glass is listening for the faintest vibration that says a new engine has started to move. Michael Baldwin didn't expect the follow-up to come by text, but the message from Kane Ashby slid across his screen with the clean confidence of a man who had already rehearsed every outcome. There were no pleasantries, no softening emojis, just a number followed by a pronouncement that landed like a challenge. That figure was Michael's salary and, Kane added, only the start. For a few seconds, Michael stared at the digits, not for their size at how they were substantial, but for the brazen simplicity of the pitch. In the gaps between courtroom wars and corporate fires, he had told himself he didn't miss this cadence, the chess rhythm of high stakes and higher egos. And yet, even before his thumbs moved, his pulse admitted what his rational defenses would not. He missed the life, he missed the glamour, he missed the sense that a single decision could ripple across a city. What he did not miss, typed with deliberate clarity, was Victor. He would not betray Victor Newman. The reply came back as quickly as it took to breathe. I'm not asking for betrayal, Kane wrote. I'm looking for someone who can simplify things. The phrasing wasn't accidental. Fixer had become a dirty word in Genoa City, stained by the implication of buried bodies and manufactured alibis. Simplify was the antiseptic cousin, the promise of making complicated systems less predatory without pretending to sanctify anyone in the process. It was a wedge driven into Michael's ambivalence with surgical accuracy. He sat at his kitchen table, phone face up beside a mug that had gone cold, and weighed the one truth he had learned the hard way. The wrong job could take pieces you never got back, but the right one, barely distinguishable from the wrong in the opening centicould, restore a sense of purpose no retirement ever truly replicates. He didn't call. He didn't need to. The exchange unfolded in short bursts. What's the scope? Guardrails and limits. No actions directly or indirectly intended to destabilize Newman or harm its people. No laundering of anyone's sins. Clear exit clauses. Quarterly reviews that could end the engagement with a single sentence if the mandate drifted. In return, Kane promised transparency at a level corporate overlords only pretended to value. No shadow ledgers, no whispered side deals, no treating Michael like a tool to be sheathed when the optics went bad. This wouldn't be a return to the old playbook, he said. This would be a new apparatus built to prevent the collisions that always cost the innocent first. Michael read the words with a lawyer's suspicion and a husband's caution. He imagined Lauren reading over his shoulder. Imagined her silence not as assent, but as the carefully held breath of someone listening for the sound of a door closing behind them. He typed out a provisional no and then honest with himself pressed backspace. He asked for time, for written terms, for a precise accounting of who hired whom and for what ends. Kane's response was unnervingly serene. It's your timeline, he wrote. When you're ready, the work is ready. Keep the number. Michael tapped the contact card, watched it fold into his phone as if it had always lived there, and reminded himself that a saved number is not a signed contract. But he also knew that in Genoa City, the distance between those two realities can vanish with the right crisis. Across town, at the Newman Ranch, Nikki had been working on a crisis of a more intimate kind, how to rescue a man she loved from the habit of living at the speed of war. Victor arrived home and found the living room transformed into an invitation to remember. Vases brimming with flowers that still smelled of the florist's cooler. A playlist spun from the music that had scored their beginnings. Lights softened to make the room feel like a secret. What's all this? Victor asked, not suspicious so much as disoriented by the absence of tactics. Nikki's answer was not a plan, but a promise. Every day with him was worth marking, and she wanted the evening to slow down long enough for the two of them to occupy it fully. They sat, not as emperor and empress of a corporate kingdom, but as to people who had climbed and survived so much turbulence that stillness felt radical. She fed him stories before food, the first time he brought her a flower that wasn't part of a bouquet, the time he'd laughed so hard at a joke he immediately vetoed as inappropriate for public consumption, the morning they'd both agreed, without saying so, that the latest war could wait until after breakfast. He relaxed into the rhythm, into the fact that someone else had lowered the volume, and for a minute the ranch wasn't a fortress, but a home. The irony, to anyone watching from outside, is that the talk they avoided inevitably found them. They'd drift Ted cows, of course they would, into conversation about Cain and, inevitably, Claire. It was a familiar loop, a dance between worry and analysis, loyalty and curiosity. Nikki let the talk happen without letting it take over. She nudged him back to the table, back to the oysters she'd had shucked as a wink to their history. Have the last one, she encouraged with a conspirator's smile. When he lifted the shell and found a ring nestled beneath the brine, the past and present snapped into alignment. Years ago, he'd given her a pearl in a shell, a gesture that said patience finds treasures. Tonight, she returned the sentiment with a ring that was less about possession than continuity. She added a leather jacket supple, impeccably cut, a whisper back to the victor who knew how to terrorize a room simply by being the most controlled thing in it. They laughed, they reminisced, and inevitably they talked about Cain again, about temptation and trust, about whether the man's audacity signaled hubris or evolution. Nikki knew better than to tell Victor what to do. The alchemy of their marriage was not in successful orders, but in successful questions. She asked him what would satisfy him in the long run. Another victory added to a shelf that could no longer hold them, or a pattern of choices that made his empire stronger by making it less volatile. She didn't say Michael's name, but she didn't have to. Victor knew exactly which retired lion Cain might try to coax back to the hunt. The ring in the oyster wasn't a metaphor he would miss. Some prizes only reveal themselves to those who don't devour everything in sight. The jacket was a reminder not to confuse gentleness with weakness. If he pursued any play involving Cain, he should do it with the steadiness of a man unwilling to be baited. And when the talk veered toward Claire because any conversation eventually detoured through the new variable in their family's, Webnicki anchored him with the same logic. Claire had become the city's favorite rumor, the story people told themselves to explain a sense of impending weather. Maybe she was learning, maybe she was burning bridges. Either way, overreaction would make things worse. Victor understood the counsel even as the old instinct thrummed beneath his ribs. Control the board, control the outcome, never cede tempo. Tonight, he let Nikki's tempo hold. Society, meanwhile, hummed at the frequency of watchful curiosity, the kind of evening where the barware made more glances than the patrons. Claire Newman and Holden Novak had chosen seats at the counter rather than a corner table, a decision that tried to say nothing to hide without quite believing itself. Holden had the body language of a man who had promised someone he would keep things calm and the face of someone who wasn't sure calm was on the menu. Enter Audra Charles, composed like a headline, dressed to be seen, but moving with the economy of someone who never makes a gesture she doesn't intend to weaponize. She slid onto the neighboring stool with a smile that made the bartender tense and, before either Claire or Holden could call for a check, dropped the first line with surgical timing. Holden, who knew a grenade when he saw one, asked her to give Claire space, but Audra's reply came cool and dismissive. She was here at exactly the right moment. She looked at the way Holden and Claire angled toward one another and called the scene cozy, then widened the triangle by invoking the ups and Kyle. Wouldn't this little tableau find its way to his ears? The implication wasn't Sutlife Claire wanted a quiet evening. She should have chosen a different city. The escalation was professional for exactly one beat. Then Audra raised the stakes with a calculated insinuation. Perhaps Claire had finally gotten smart and dropped Kyle because he was a cheat. The charge hung between the three of them like a live wire. Claire, who had been practicing self-possession the way some people train for marathons, lost the beat and told Audra to get lost, her words carrying enough acid to burn through the evening's restraint. She named Audra exactly what Audra had spent months inviting people to call her and got back a smile so thin it could have sliced glass. Audra pivoted without missing a step, addressing Holden as if he were a civilian caught in the crossfire and asking, with a bored sort of curiosity, how he felt about their little date. Had he made a move yet? She wondered aloud, as if provoking a response were the whole point of the exercise. Holden stiffened, then steadied, using the same even voice he saved for diffusing powder keg calls. He and Claire were having a drink, nothing more. And he didn't owe details to someone who made a sport of detonating other people's lives. The bartender shifted his stance, the couple at the end table stopped pretending not to listen, and for a long heartbeat, all of Genoa City seemed to balance on whether Claire would walk or swing. But Audra rarely plays for immediate reaction. She plays for outcomes that require a dozen tiny cuts. She pivoted again, lowering her voice just enough that only her targets could hear, and mused that men like Kyle hate uncertainty. If Claire wanted to punish him for his sense real or imagine Ed Fear were more efficient ways. She mentioned moonlight and secrets, invoking a rendezvous that Kyle would never admit and that Audra would never fully describe, refining the insinuation into a toxin designed to travel faster than proof. Claire felt the familiar surge of rage braided with doubt, that vulnerable edge where memory of harm meets the possibility of manipulation. Holden put a hand on the bar, not on her, a gesture that offered gravity without presumption, and reminded Audra that whatever game she was playing had rules legal, ethical, human. Audra countered with the kind of smile that makes policy feel like a suggestion and told Claire, sweetly, to enjoy her evening. She had only stopped by to compliment the audacity of doing damage in the open. Then, with a glance at her phone that suggested she had better rooms waiting, she slid off the stool and left the fragrance of expensive perfume behind like a signature. If the scene at Society was a small war, the battle inside Claire afterward was the real theater. She sat rigid a minute longer than necessary, running through the mental checklist that keeps a person from doing something expensive. Inhale, exhale, count the glasses on the bar, inventory exits, decide who you are going to be for the next 10 minutes. She looked at Holden, saw no judgment in his face, just concern calibrated to give her a choice, and chose, finally, not to perform for Audra's ghost. She paid the tab. She walked out without looking over her shoulder. On the sidewalk, she laughed Ansia short, mirthless sound at the absurdity of trying to live a private life in a town that treats privacy like contraband. She knew Kyle would hear about this, and she didn't know whether part of her wanted him to. She also knew that the version of herself who used to drink to cut the noise would not win tonight. Holden asked if she was all right. She said yes and surprised herself by meaning it. Somewhere behind them, someone was already texting someone else about what they had just witnessed. News true, partial, inventetrivals in Genoa City with a speed that would make a wire service blush. By the time Nikki and Victor were rinsing oyster brine off their fingers, someone had told someone else that Claire and Holden had entertained company at Society, and that the company had left a smoke trail. Nikki poured Victor a final splash and weighed, with the expertise of a lifetime, whether to mention the rumor. She decided not to. Tonight's victory was not about controlling narratives, but about securing a ceasefire inside the man she loved. She brought the conversation back to the small and personal, to the way the leather jacket looked on him when he first stood, to the way the ring in the shell had made his mouth relax at the corners. She had engineered a kind of timeout that restored the muscle memory of tenderness. There would be time enough for Claire. There would always be time for Claire. Victor let himself be steered back into the harbor of their shared jokes. He remembered why he had survived so many campaigns, not because he was tireless, but because he had a partner who understood when to call the retreat that saved the army. Kane closed his own evening without the high of a trophy or the low of a door slammed in his face. He didn't send more texts. He didn't sit in the dark staring at his phone. He drafted a 2-page memo, a living document, not a trip outlining exactly what Simplify would mean if Michael ever said yes. It spoke of clean processes and transparent interventions, of training executives not to mistake urgency for importance, of responding to fire without arson, of protecting workers who always seemed to absorb the blowback when titans collided. It named no names and cast no aspersions. He printed it and slid it into a folder labeled Simply Framework. Then he made another list, this one old-fashioned and messy, the few people in town whose integrity wasn't performative. The auditors who didn't accept industry standard as a synonym for ethically fine, the techs who could extract signal from noise without inventing a signal because a client wanted one. If Michael came aboard, he would find a scaffold designed to hold weight. If he didn't, Kane would build it anyway and let the scaffold itself become the message. Michael, meanwhile, did what people do when the future taps politely. He went for a walk with Lauren. He didn't rehearse his case. He didn't paint Kane as a demon or a saint. He described a shapework that looked like mitigation rather than warfare. Boundaries that could be defended without turning his marriage into a series of apologies. A salary that was undeniably persuasive and a mandate that could be made humane. Lauren listened, and when he stopped, she didn't list conditions so much as a single truth. She wanted him whole. If he could do this and remain himself, she could live with the weight. If the work asked for pieces he couldn't grow back, then no sum, no glamour, no nostalgia could justify the price. It was not a threat or a test. It was a reminder of the pact they had made to be rigorous about the lives they were building. Michael kissed her temple and admitted something he hadn't let himself say. He didn't want to live with nothing hard left to do. He also didn't want to live in a way that required constant triage. They walked home the long way, the kind of silence between them that isn't empty but full. In the days that followed, the city offered its usual blend of theater and static. Someone swore they saw Kane at a table with a compliance legend who never takes meetings without NDA letters. Someone else claimed Victor had turned down a chance to break an opponent in half simply because Nikki had asked him to consider the optics and the sleep he would lose. Audra, for her part, floated through rooms like a weather front, confident that she had stirred enough to keep Claire off balance. Kyle, predictably, heard 3 versions of the society story before lunch, each tailored to the teller's hope that he would either explode or repent. He did neither. He called no one. He went for a drive he pretended was about errands and ended up exactly nowhere. The kind of nowhere that looks like a parking lot behind an unremarkable building and feels like a pause you don't know how to end. Holden sent Claire a single line, "Proud of you." Claire stared at it too long and then smiled at how absurdly powerful words can be when they arrive at the right time.